Hey, this is Rusty from Pinal County House Buyer. I wanted to introduce a concept called subject to, or buying a house subject to the existing loan. Now, this was a pretty common thing that happened in the 70s, early 80s when interest rates would go up each year. So if somebody would have bought a house, got a loan for about 7% interest in the mid 70s, somebody coming in to buy the house in 1979, they were looking at like a 13% interest rate. And so a lot of times, the people that had that 7 or 8% interest rate would sell their house subject to the existing loan so that the new buyer could actually afford the payment. And so this was a pretty common thing then, less common now because we see interest rates going down. And so new loans are actually cheaper than old loans. But then old loans were cheaper than new loans. And so that's why subject to was so popular back in the 70s. So let me kind of dive into this a little bit deeper. So say you got a loan on this house for $100,000. The house is worth $110,000. So you have a buyer giving a seller $10,000, which is the difference between their offer for the house and the mortgage on the house. And so the seller gets $10,000 and this remains. So the house now is owned by the seller, by the buyer, but this mortgage is still in the name of the seller. Now this happens quite a bit more with house buyers. House buyers can offer higher offers to sellers if they can use the existing loan, because then that saves them from having to go out and get expensive hard money that they're paying 10 to 12 to 15% on. And so if they can get an existing loan that's only 4 or 5%, they're pretty excited about that. So, in my case, or in any other real estate investors' cases, if they can buy a house here for $110,000 and only have to pay the seller $10,000 and then take over the existing loan, that works out for their benefit. Now, typically, the real estate investor will then throw in probably about $15,000 to $20,000 into this house. So this house gets its upgrades. It gets a new kitchen, gets new flooring, new paint, maybe a new AC, that kind of thing. And so then the value of this house goes up to $150,000. Now, what typically would happen there is, okay, so now they've got equity and they have money in the deal. And so they will either refinance to pull the money out that they put into it, and this loan that it was still in the seller's name disappears because a refinance pays off existing loans. And so that'll happen between 3 and 5 months after the initial purchase. The other way this loan disappears is if the buyer does those same repairs, increases the value to $150,000, and then sells it to a new buyer. Now, in that next transaction, this same loan also gets paid off again. So typically with subject to deals, subject to the existing loan deals, the loans get paid off within 3 to 6 months. It's usually a very short-term thing. And let me talk about the worst case scenario with these. So worst case scenario, the seller gets their equity of $10,000. The investor then throws in $15,000 to $20,000 into the existing house and makes it better and worth more. And if that investor stops paying on that mortgage, then that seller can actually take the house back from the investor, which would be so silly of the investor to do. It doesn't make any sense at all. But the seller could potentially get a house with $20,000 worth of upgrades back and the $10,000 that they got from the buyer in the initial transaction. And so that is when you're selling to a house buyer and investor, That's typically the worst case scenario, which rarely ever happens. And so that is taking a house subject to the existing loan, or buying a house subject to the existing loan.